Wounded and weeping by a lonely river, a young Apache woman was running for her life when a rancher found her, and what happened next would change everything both of them believed about the world. Ephraim Boone had ridden this stretch of Arizona territory 1,000 times without hearing anything more than wind and cattle and his own boots on the porch boards, and he almost rode past the sound now, a broken, muffled crying carried thin on the evening air from somewhere beyond the cottonwoods that lined the river below his land. Almost. But something in it stopped him cold in the saddle, and he turned his horse toward the water instead of toward home. Stay with me through this one, because it does not end where you expect it to. A woman with nothing left but the will to keep her little brother alive. A man who had spent years convincing himself he needed nothing beyond his horse and his land, and 3 riders somewhere behind her who were not chasing a runaway, they were chasing a bounty. What started at that river would not stay at that river. It would carry all 3 of them across days of dry country and abandoned mining camps, toward a reunion that would leave none of them the same. Tell me in the comments where you're watching this from tonight, and settle in, because this one earns every minute. If a story like this one is worth your time, tap the join button beside the channel name and become a channel member, and it helps keep frontier stories like this alive. Ephraim Boone was 36 years old that summer of 1884, and he had built the kind of life a man builds when he decides that company costs more than it's worth. His spread sat 11 miles from the nearest town, a dusty crossroads known as Cotter's Bend that was barely large enough to earn the name, tucked against a run of low red hills where the wind blew hot and steady from May clear through September. He ran close to 300 head of cattle with the help of one hired man who rode out from town only when the work demanded it, and he had built his own house with his own hands the summer he turned 24, setting every board himself because he trusted his own work more than he trusted most people's promises. He had not always been alone. His mother and father had come west with him as a boy, chasing land and a fresh start neither of them lived to see finished. A fever took them both inside of 2 winters, back when Ephraim was barely 20, and he had buried them on a low rise behind the house with a view of the valley his mother used to say reminded her of home. In the 16 years since, he had let the ranch and the work and the long quiet evenings fill up the space a family might have filled instead. Men in Cotter's Bend thought him solitary, and a few thought him hard, and Ephraim had long since stopped correcting either word, because arguing about it always felt like wasted breath. He kept a full larder, a good fire, and a door he rarely opened to anyone he had not known for years. There had been, once, a widow's daughter in town who made no secret of her interest, and a season or 2 where Ephraim had let himself imagine what it might look like to fill the second chair at his supper table. It had come to nothing, not out of any quarrel, but out of the same slow drift that ended most things he did not actively fight to keep. He had put off riding into town one too many Sundays, and by the time he noticed the silence had become permanent, she had already accepted an offer from a shopkeeper 2 towns over. He had not chased after it. He believed, mostly, that a man who had already buried the 2 people he loved most had earned the right to stop risking that particular kind of loss again. His hired man, a wiry, weather-cured old-timer named Silas, who had worked the neighboring spreads for 30 years before his knees gave out on him, was the closest thing to company Ephraim kept on a regular basis. And even Silas rode home to his own cabin in town most nights rather than sleep under Ephraim's roof. That evening he had ridden out to check a stretch of fence along the river before full dark, and he was nearly home again, letting his horse pick its own way along the familiar trail, when the wind carried the sound that stopped him cold. In a small clearing where the cottonwoods opened toward the water, he found her. A young Apache woman sat curled against the trunk of the largest tree, knees drawn to her chest, her dark hair tangled and dust-caked from what looked like days on the move. Her clothing was torn at one shoulder, and beneath the torn cloth of her sleeve, a shallow wound along her forearm had gone dark and crusted, days old and never properly cleaned. She heard his horse before she saw him, and her whole body went rigid, eyes wide and glassy with a fear so raw it made Ephraim's chest tighten just to see it. He stopped his horse well short of her and swung down slowly, hands rising, empty, palms open to the darkening sky. He had heard the talk in Cotter's Bend. The loose and ugly stories men spread about Apache bands and trouble along the territory line. Stories that shifted shape depending on who last passed them along. And he had learned a long time ago that a saloon story was built more out of fear than fact. Whatever was in front of him now was not a story. It was a young woman alone in the dark, wounded, and terrified of a stranger's horse. She could not have been more than 22 at the outside, her dress torn and travel-stained and her moccasins worn nearly through at the sole, the kind of wear that came only from days of hard walking over rough country. Every line of her body carried the mark of exhaustion, pushed past any reasonable limit. The way her shoulders had given up holding themselves square, the way her eyes, even wide with fear, kept losing focus for half a second at a time before snapping back to him. Ephraim had seen that particular kind of tired only twice before in his life, once in a man who had walked 3 days for help after a wagon wreck, and once in himself, the winter he buried his mother and father within 11 days of each other and somehow kept the cattle fed anyway. It was not a tired that slept off in one night. It went down into the bone. He knelt where he stood and set his canteen on a flat stone between them, along with the last of the bread and dried meat from his saddlebag. And then he did the only thing that felt right. He stepped back. 3 full steps, then 4, until there was open ground between them, and she could see, plainly, that he meant to close no more of that distance without her say-so. For a long time, neither of them moved. The river ran on behind her, indifferent, and somewhere upstream a nightjar cried twice and went quiet. Then, inch by inch, she crawled forward and took the canteen in both shaking hands and drank like a woman who had not let herself drink freely in days. Elu'u, the word came finally, her voice cracked and hoarse, as she pressed a hand flat to her own chest. Elu'u. Ephraim gave his own name in return, low and unhurried, and something in the plainness of it seemed to ease her by a fraction. He motioned toward the wound on her arm and toward the strip of clean cloth he tore from the tail of his own shirt, and when she flinched at the offer, he set the cloth on the stone beside the canteen instead and stepped back again, letting her tend it herself while he watched from a respectful distance, hands still visible, still open. She wrapped the wound with quick, practiced movements, the kind that made clear this was not the first injury she had nursed alone out here, and Ephraim found himself wondering, with a low ache he did not examine too closely, how many other wounds she had already tended, without anyone standing anywhere near close enough to help. The last color was draining out of the sky by the time she finished, and Ephraim built a small fire on the flat rock where the canteen had sat, more from instinct than plan, and Elu watched the flame catch with the wary stillness of someone deciding, moment by moment, whether it was safe to let her guard down even this much. She did not come closer to the fire than she had to, but she did not move farther away from it either, and when Ephraim settled onto a low rock a careful distance off and kept silent for a long while, simply let the fire and the river fill the silence between them, something in her shoulders finally, slowly, began to unknot. She did not tell him, not yet, what had put her on this riverbank half-starved and running, and he did not ask. He had learned, over 16 years of dealing with spooked cattle and skittish horses and the occasional frightened traveler passing through, that a creature pressed hard enough by fear revealed its own story in its own time, and that pushing only ever bought you a longer silence. So he waited, and let the fire and the river do the talking that neither of them was ready to do out loud yet. But once, when he glanced east toward the darkening hills, her whole face changed, not fear this time, but something sharper, more urgent, and she gave one word he understood without translation. A name, spoken like a prayer, Kai. He did not press her on it. Whatever family she had lost out there in the dark, it was not his to demand answers about. Not yet. Not from a woman who had only just decided his open hands were not a trick. The river had gone almost peaceful again, the last light draining out of the sky behind the hills, when Elu's face changed a second time, and this time there was no mistaking it for anything but pure, animal fear. Ephraim heard it a heartbeat after she did, hoofbeats, more than one horse, coming steady along the trail above the water. She was on her feet before he could speak, her whole body coiled toward the trees, and she managed 3 words that needed no more explanation than her face already gave him. They found me. Ephraim moved fast and quiet, the way a man moves who has spent 16 years learning this land in the dark. There was a cottonwood thicker than the rest a dozen yards back from the water, its trunk wide enough to swallow a person whole in shadow, and he steered her behind it with a hand at her shoulder, light as he could make it, and then he stepped clear into the open himself, planting his boots in plain sight where a man with nothing to hide would stand. 3 riders came down out of the dark a few minutes later, their horses lathered from hard use, and the man in front reined up first. A lean, sun-cured rider with a badge that wasn't a badge, pinned crooked to his vest, and a voice that carried the particular flatness of a man used to being obeyed. Rance, the others used the name once, in passing, and Ephraim filed it away and stayed quiet. He had heard of men like Rance before, though never had reason to stand this close to one. There was a certain breed that drifted through territory like this, chasing paper, bounty notices tacked up in trading posts and army way stations, offering money for the return of anyone unlucky enough to be caught on the wrong side of whatever conflict was currently unsettling the line. It made no difference to men like Rance whether the person on the paper was guilty of anything at all. A frightened young woman traveling alone was worth exactly as much as a wanted outlaw, and considerably easier to catch, and Ephraim felt something cold and hard settle into his chest as he understood, all at once, precisely what kind of danger he had just placed himself between. "You seen an Apache girl out here?" Rance asked, his eyes moving over the clearing, over Ephraim's horse, over the dark tree line behind him. Traveling alone. Hurt, likely. Ephraim let his gaze drift toward the cottonwood for exactly as long as a curious man's gaze might drift, no longer, and then he shook his head, calm as a man discussing weather. "Seen nobody out here but my own cattle in 2 days," he said. "River's quiet tonight." One of the other riders swung down without instruction and crouched at the edge of the clearing, running 2 fingers along a set of prints pressed into the soft mud, not 6 feet from where Elu stood frozen against the bark, close enough that Ephraim could hear her breath catch and hold. The rider studied the ground a long moment, long enough that Ephraim's pulse climbed into his throat, and then straightened and shrugged toward Rance. Cattle tracks and an old boot print. Nothing fresh. Rance held Ephraim's eyes a moment longer than was comfortable, the way a man does when he is deciding whether to believe you or press harder, and then he nodded once, slow. "If you do see her," he said, "you'd do well not to interfere. There's money riding on this one, and money makes men careless about who gets in the way." Ephraim stayed silent, only watched them turn their horses and ride on along the trail, and he did not let his shoulders drop until the sound of hooves had faded entirely into the dark. Even then he stood a long moment listening for the trick of it, the old rancher's habit of trusting his ears over his eyes in failing light, half expecting the hoofbeats to swing back around on him. They did not. Whatever else Rance was, he was not, tonight, a patient man, and patience was apparently a luxury he did not think this particular clearing had earned. He did not go back for her right away. He waited, counting his own heartbeat, until he was certain the sound of the riders was truly gone and not merely circling back to test him, and only then did he cross to the cottonwood and find her still pressed to the bark, shaking, one hand fisted in the fabric over her heart. "We're not staying here," he told her. "Quiet. There's a trail up through the hills that no rider takes if he can help it. Too narrow and too rough on the horses. It'll get us home before that road does." She understood enough of it, or trusted enough of the steadiness in his voice, because she followed him without argument to where his horse waited, and he helped her up into the saddle before he took the reins and led the animal on foot along a trail he had ridden 100 times in daylight and now had to feel his way through, half by memory in the dark. It was full night, and the moon was climbing by the time the ranch house appeared below them, one window still holding a low-banked fire, and Elu's grip on the saddle horn eased, by degrees, the closer they came to it. Inside, he built the fire higher and set water heating and laid out what food the larder held, and Elu ate slowly at first, then faster, the careful hunger of someone who had learned not to trust a full plate to still be there in 5 minutes. He warmed water enough for her to properly clean the wound on her arm, set out clean cloth and the salve he kept for his own cuts and scrapes, and left her the small back room off the kitchen, without a word about how long she might need it for. He gave her the spare room and the only decent blanket in the house, and when he checked on her once before turning in himself, she was already asleep on top of the covers, still in her boots, one hand curled loosely near her face, the way a person sleeps only when the body has simply run out of any strength left to keep watch. Ephraim sat a long while on the porch that night before he went to bed, looking out at the dark line of hills where 3 armed riders had ridden through country he thought he knew better than any man alive, and he found himself thinking, for the first time in longer than he could easily count, that his own quiet house had never once in 16 years felt as full as it did with one exhausted stranger sleeping down the hall. If you want more stories like this one, tap join beside the channel name and become a member, and it helps keep these stories coming, and it means a lot to us. Dawn found her already outside, standing at the corral fence in the thin gray light before sunrise, wrapped in the blanket he had given her, her eyes fixed east toward a line of distant mountains that Ephraim recognized, roughly, as the country around the old Bisley trading trail. He came out with 2 cups of coffee and set one on the fence rail near her, without a word, and for a while they simply stood there together, watching the light climb. Her family's camp had been scattered 3 days before he found her, she explained slowly, piecing the words together from the little English she had, and the rest from gesture and patience on both their parts. A conflict along the territory line, soldiers on one side, and riders like the ones from last night on the other. And in the panic of it, her people had broken apart in every direction at once, running for whichever cover was nearest. She had run with her mother as far as the second river crossing before her mother pressed her hand hard and urged her to keep going, to not look back, and Elu had not seen her since. Somewhere in that same chaos, her little brother Kai, 8 years old, small enough to still need carrying on the hard stretches, had vanished from her side entirely, and she had spent 3 days since telling herself he was alive out there somewhere, rather than let herself believe anything else. She thought he might have made it toward the old trading trail, because it was the route their father had taught them both to remember if they were ever separated. A single word drilled into each child until it stuck. The crossing, the crossing, the crossing. It was the only thread she had, and she meant to follow it alone if she had to. Wound or no wound, riders or no riders. She described Kai the way a person describes someone they are afraid to picture in the past tense, small for his age but stubborn beyond his years, the kind of boy who trailed after her everywhere their mother let him, who had cried the first time she left him behind on a hunting trip and had not stopped begging until she agreed to teach him to track rabbits himself so he would never have to be left behind again. He carried a wooden toy horse their father had carved for him, small enough to fit in a closed fist, and she had seen him clutching it still in the last moment she'd glimpsed him, before the chaos of that day swallowed him from view. It was such a small, ordinary thing to hold on to in the middle of so much fear, and yet it was the detail that seemed to steady her most as she recalled it. As if the toy horse being real made the boy holding it real too, and alive, somewhere out past those mountains. Ephraim looked at that stretch of hard, dry mountains for a long moment, and he thought about 16 years of a house too quiet, and about 2 graves on the rise behind it, and about what it had cost him to lose the only family he'd ever had without so much as the mercy of a warning. He knew that country well enough to know it was no place for one wounded woman traveling alone, and he knew, better than most men might have, exactly what it meant to a person to lose the last of their family and have no one willing to help them look. "I'll go with you," he said. "We'll need horses, water for 4 days, and whatever I've got that passes for a medical kit. If your brother's out there, 2 of us stand a far better chance of finding him than 1. She looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for whatever it was people search for when a stranger offers them something this large, and whatever she found there seemed to settle something in her, because she nodded once, and for the first time since the river, something close to hope moved behind her eyes. Before they left, Ephraim rode the 4 miles into Cotter's Bend to leave word with Silas about the cattle, and to buy what extra provisions the general store could spare on short notice. And the old hired man had listened to the whole of it, the river, the wound, the riders, the missing boy, without once interrupting, and had only nodded slowly at the end of it, and promised to keep an eye on the herd as long as it took, and to bring the boy home safe. It was, Ephraim thought, riding back out of town. The kind of easy trust a man did not get to spend more than a few times in his life, and he found he was grateful for it, in a way he had not expected to be grateful for anything that morning. They rode out within the hour, 2 horses loaded light with water and food, and the small tin box of bandages and salve Ephraim kept for cattle and men alike, and for the days that followed, the 2 of them crossed a stretch of Arizona territory that showed no particular interest in making the search easy. Dry valleys gave way to dry washes, gave way to more dry valleys. The sun, a hard, flat weight overhead by mid-morning every day, and more than once they passed the cold ashes of an abandoned camp that revealed nothing except that other frightened people had passed this way before them. What they discovered, riding together through all of it, was that their skills fit together in ways neither of them had expected. Elu read the land the way Ephraim read weather. She could look at a broken stem of grass, a disturbed patch of gravel, the angle a startled bird had flown off in, and tell him which way a person on foot had gone and roughly how many hours before. Ephraim, in turn, knew horses and knew tired bodies, knew which dry wash would hold water if you dug 2 feet down, and which stand of rock would break the wind enough to make a safe camp for the night. Knowledge worth more out here than any map. They talked more than either of them expected to, in the slow hours between one clue and the next, not about the riders, not yet, but about smaller things, the kind of things 2 people share when they have decided, without quite saying so, to trust each other with the hours of a hard day. She confided in him about her father, gone 2 winters now, and the trail word he'd taught his children. He shared, in return, his own history, his parents, the fever, 16 years of choosing quiet over company, because quiet had never once left him the way people eventually did. The first night out, camped in a shallow rock overhang that broke the worst of the wind, Elu taught him 3 words in her own language, patient with his clumsy attempts at the sounds, laughing softly, for the first time since the river, when he mangled the second one badly enough that even he had to smile at himself. In return, he showed her how he read the stars to hold a straight line at night, when the trail itself had gone invisible, tracing with one finger the handle of the dipper and the fixed point it pointed toward, and she watched him with the particular attention of someone filing away a tool she intended to use again. It struck him, watching her do it, that she was not a woman who accepted help so much as a woman who traded for it, fair and even, and he found he respected that more than he could easily have explained. The second day brought them through a stretch of broken country where water grew scarce enough to worry about, the stream beds they crossed gone to cracked mud, and the canteens riding lighter on the saddle horns than either of them liked. It was Ephraim who finally signaled the stop, reading the shape of a low rock formation the way another man might read a signpost, and it was his shovel and his patience that turned up a seep of brackish but drinkable water 2 feet under a dry wash bottom, enough to refill both canteens and let the horses drink their fill before they pushed on. Yilu had watched him dig without a word of doubt in her face, and when the water finally welled up dark in the bottom of the hole, she had looked at him with something that was not quite surprise and not quite anything he had a name for yet. That same evening, resting the horses in the last hour of daylight, Elu grew quiet in a different way than the watchful silence she usually kept. And when Ephraim finally pressed gently to learn what troubled her, she confessed, haltingly, that she was afraid not just of failing to find her brother, but of what it would mean about herself if she did fail. That her mother had trusted her with the one thing that mattered most, and that trust felt, some hours, like a weight she was not entirely sure her own strength could carry the rest of the way. Ephraim had no easy answer for that, and did not try to invent one. He only assured her, plainly, that a woman who had walked 3 days alone on a wounded leg, rather than stop looking, was not a woman anybody needed to worry about running out of strength, and that he intended to keep saying so for as many days as it took her to believe it herself. By the 3rd day, the land had begun to change, the flat, dry valleys giving way to a rockier, more broken country that climbed steadily toward the foothills, and twice that afternoon, they crossed the ashes of camps recent enough to still hold the shape of hurried departure, a scattered cook fire, a torn strip of cloth caught on brush, the kind of small abandoned things that carried a story neither of them voiced out loud. Elu grew quieter as the day wore on, her eyes rarely leaving the ground ahead of them, and once, cresting a low ridge, she stopped so suddenly that Ephraim's whole chest seized before he understood she had only spotted a distant line of riders far off to the north, too far and too indistinct to tell friend from danger, moving away from them rather than toward. They waited, motionless, in the thin shade of a rock outcrop, until the distant riders had dropped below the horizon and out of sight, and only then did either of them let out the breath they had both been holding. Somewhere in the third day of it, riding side by side through a country that could kill either of them if they stopped paying attention, Ephraim caught himself watching the sure, steady way she read a trail he could barely see, and thought that he had not, in longer than he wanted to admit, looked forward to a single day the way he found himself looking forward to the next one beside her. The fourth morning began under a sky the color of a bruise, heat pressing down early and hard even before the sun had fully cleared the ridgeline, and both of them felt the difference in the air, before either voiced it out loud, the particular stillness that meant weather was building somewhere behind those far peaks, and would reach them eventually whether or not they had found what they were looking for by then. Elu pushed the pace without needing prompting. Reading something in the wind, Ephraim only half trusted himself to read as well as she did, and by afternoon that hurried, heat-heavy pace had carried them into a dry wash that curled up toward the foothills, where her horse stopped so abruptly that Ephraim nearly rode past her before he understood why. Caught on the low thorn of a mesquite bush, snagged and fluttering faintly in the hot wind, was a scrap of blue cloth no bigger than a man's palm. She was off her horse before Ephraim had fully reined in, kneeling in the dust with the scrap held so tightly in both hands that her knuckles went pale. "Kai's shirt," she said, her voice breaking clean in half around the words. He made it this far. He made it this far alone. For the first time since the river, Ephraim watched something other than grief or fear move across her face, something fragile and bright, that he understood, without needing an explanation, was the first real shape hope had taken in 4 days. He gave her a moment with it before he moved, crouching to study the ground around the thorn bush the way she had taught him to over the last 3 days, and he found, faint but real, the print of a small bare foot pressed into a patch of softer dirt a few yards on, pointed steadily uphill. Someone that size, alone out here, walking with purpose rather than stumbling. It was, they both agreed without needing to say it aloud, the best sign either of them had found yet that the boy was not simply surviving, but still moving toward something on his own. The trail the scrap of blue cloth pointed toward climbed steadily through a fold of rocky hills and came out, an hour before dusk, on the bones of an old mining settlement. A scatter of collapsed timber frames, and one leaning head frame standing black against the sky. The whole place gone quiet and gray, with years of abandonment. They walked the horses in slow, both of them scanning the ruined buildings, calling out softly every few dozen yards in case the boy could hear but was too frightened or too weak to answer on his own. They checked a collapsed bunkhouse first, and then the black mouth of the mine shaft itself, close enough to look inside, but not far enough to risk the timbering, and found nothing in either but old dust and the scurry of something small in the dark. Elu's face had begun to fall by the time they reached the last standing structure, a low wooden shed at the far edge of the settlement that had somehow kept most of its roof, and it was Ephraim who stopped first, one hand raised, at its half-open door. Something had moved inside it, a small sound, thin and weak, barely more than a breath given shape. Elu was through the doorway before Ephraim could say a word of caution, and he heard her cry out, a sound that carried no fear in it at all this time, only something raw and overwhelming, and when he stepped in behind her, he found her on her knees in the dust with her arms wrapped tight around a small, filthy, hollow-cheeked boy who was clinging to her with both fists like he meant never to let go again. Kai was alive, weak and starved thin, and shaking, but alive and breathing, and folded so completely into his sister's arms that for a long moment neither one of them made a sound, only held on. Ephraim stood in the doorway a moment longer, looking at the two of them tangled together on the floor of a ruined shed at the edge of nowhere, and then he stepped back outside into the last of the daylight and left them the room to have this moment without a stranger's eyes on it. He had ridden into this territory 16 years ago, chasing land, and had spent every year since telling himself land was enough. Standing outside that shed, listening to a boy laugh weakly through tears at something his sister had shared with him, Ephraim understood, all at once and completely, that he had been wrong about that for a very long time. The shed, once his eyes adjusted to the dim light inside it, turned out to have sheltered the boy for at least a day or two. A nest of old grain sacks pulled into one corner, a few chewed mesquite pods scattered nearby, that showed Ephraim the child had been eating whatever the desert provided, rather than starve outright, and a single dented tin cup, clearly scavenged from somewhere among the ruined buildings, that Kai had apparently been using to catch what little rainwater found its way through the gaps in the roof. It was, Ephraim thought, looking at the small evidence of a child's stubborn will to survive laid out around him, about as clear a picture of quiet courage as he had ever come across in 16 years on this land. Ephraim knelt beside them both and did what he could, checking the boy over with the same careful, unhurried hands he had used on Elu's arm days before. A few scrapes, a badly bruised ankle he must have been favoring for days, ribs that stood out sharper than they should on a boy his age. But no fever, no wound that wouldn't heal with rest and food and time. He found their store of dried meat and softened a strip of it in warm water from the canteen, feeding Kai small, careful bites the way a person feeds someone whose stomach has forgotten what to do with a full meal. And the boy ate slowly, watching Ephraim the whole while with wide, wary, exhausted eyes that had clearly learned in the last few days to be cautious of anyone new. It was only when Elu gave him something low and reassuring in their own language, her hand never once leaving her brother's shoulder, that some of the wariness finally went out of him, and he let himself lean the rest of the way into his sister's side and close his eyes. They made camp that night within sight of the mining settlement's ruined headframe, Kai fed and wrapped in every blanket they had between them, sleeping the deep, boneless sleep of a child who finally felt safe enough to let go of watching the dark. Elu sat close to the fire long after her brother had gone still and quiet, and when Ephraim settled beside her with the last of the coffee, she did not move away. "Thank you," she said, simply, her eyes on the flames rather than on him, "for the food at the river, for the tree, for all of it." "You don't owe me thanks for doing what was right in front of me," Ephraim told her, and meant it, but he did not move away either, and for a long while the two of them sat shoulder to shoulder in the firelight, saying nothing further, needing to say nothing further, while 3 days' worth of fear finally started to loosen its grip on both of them at once. They rode back into the ranch 2 days later, slower this time, careful of Kai's strength, and by the time the house came into view, the boy was sitting up straight in front of his sister on the saddle, pointing at the cattle scattered across the near pasture with the particular wide-eyed wonder of a child who has decided, against every hard thing behind him, that the world still holds things worth being curious about. Silas rode out the next morning as he always did, and stopped dead in the yard at the sight of an unfamiliar woman hanging wash, and a boy chasing the barn cat across the porch steps, and Ephraim, watching his hired man's face work through surprise into something that looked a great deal like approval, found he did not much care what anyone in Cotter's Bend eventually made of it. Word would travel, the way it always did in a country this empty, but for the first time in 16 years, Ephraim found he had something worth the talk. That evening, the three of them sat together on the porch and watched the sun go down behind the same hills that had nearly swallowed all of them a week before. Kai already half asleep against his sister's side, with a full stomach for the first time in longer than he could probably remember, and Elu's hand resting, easy now, inches from Ephraim's on the porch rail between them. Neither of them closed that last small distance, not that night. But neither of them moved their hand away either, and something about the quiet of it conveyed more than either of them had found the words for yet. In the months that followed, Elu and Kai did not leave. There was work enough on the ranch for hands willing to learn it, and Elu learned fast, taking to the horses and the cattle work with the same steady patience she had shown reading a trail across open desert, until Silas himself allowed, grudgingly and then not so grudgingly, that she had a better eye for a sick animal than most men he'd worked alongside in 30 years. Kai grew stronger and browner and louder by the week, the hollows in his cheeks filling back in. The wooden toy horse his father had carved him riding permanently now in his shirt pocket. And he followed Ephraim around the corral with a boy's endless stream of questions that Ephraim, to his own quiet surprise, found himself never once tired of answering. He taught the boy to sit a saddle properly and to mend a length of fence, and Kai in turn taught him 3 more words of his own language than Elu ever had, delighted every single time by how badly Ephraim still mangled the second one. By the time the first frost came that autumn, Kai had taken to calling him nothing at all like a stranger's name, and Ephraim had stopped correcting him because it no longer felt like something that needed correcting. The house that had stood too quiet for 16 years filled up, slowly and then all at once, with the ordinary noise of a family finding its shape, footsteps in the hall, low talk over supper, a boy's laughter carrying across the yard at dusk, and, some evenings, Elu's voice humming something low and unfamiliar and beautiful while she worked, a song from a home that no longer existed except in the family she was quietly building in its place. Word did travel through Cotter's Bend, as Ephraim had known it would, and some of it was unkind in the way small-town talk about anything unfamiliar tends to be. But more of it, in time, was not. Silas saw to some of that himself, telling anyone who'd listen about the woman who could doctor a sick horse better than the town's own veterinarian, and the storekeeper's wife, who had lost a brother of her own to fever years back, brought out preserves and a length of good cloth the first time Elu came into town, and made no mention of where she'd come from, only wondered, kindly, whether the boy liked peppermint. Ephraim had half expected to have to fight for the life he was building. Mostly, in the end, he only had to be patient and let people meet Elu and Kai for who they actually were, rather than for the shape of the fear the loose talk had built around them. Ephraim never did go back to believing that a man needed nothing beyond his horse and his land. He had ridden out one evening to check a fence line, and instead found a wounded, weeping stranger huddled by a river with nothing left in the world but her brother's name on her lips. And in helping her carry that name all the way to the boy still breathing at the end of it, Ephraim Boone had found something he had stopped letting himself look for. Not land, not reputation. A family, built slowly out of shared danger and shared trust, and beside him on the porch most evenings now, a woman whose hand had stopped needing an excuse to find his. He had gone looking for nothing that day at the river. He had come home with everything.